Horror is a genre that has undergone many changes over the last century. We've come a long way from vampires and Frankenstein to full-on dramas and thrillers with complex and interesting social commentary. And with any film, it's important to create a narrative that is relevant to the audience, and horror is no exception. The filmmaker's main question when creating this film is, what's scary? And everyone would give their own answer to that question. But it's not just fears, but the context of when the film is made is equally, if not more important to the film itself. Let me explain by looking at two of horror's most famous films in horror history: Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 horror flick Psycho, and John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978. Believe it or not, these films actually do have a lot in common. Apart from different narratives, they both involve a mentally ill male figure murdering off characters, both spouted multiple sequels, some scenes and cinematography are extremely similar, and obviously we can't forget that Janet Leigh, Psycho's main character for the good first half of the film, is the mother of the main character Laurie Strode of Halloween, and they are both screen queens of their own time. But let's look at the key differences in terms of historical context. Psycho was made in a time of censorship as well as technical innovation. Unlike Halloween, Psycho was adapted from a novel with a similar name by Robert Bloch. The novel itself was actually interestingly based off a true murder case in Wisconsin, giving it points for already being scarier because it does have a real murder behind it. Hitchcock was able to buy the rights to the novel, but his studio Paramount had absolutely no interest in him doing the film. In order to convince them, he proposed a lower budget that he would actually himself provide, which required the film to be made in black and white rather than color, hence why the film was made in black and white even though the technology was readily available for him to use. The studio believed that the book was too repulsive and inappropriate to be put on the big screen, as no films like it had ever been made, and obviously today's standards, Psycho is not that intense of a film. Hitchcock was also able to cast huge stars in his film mainly due to his already known reputation in the time in Hollywood. He had already created many films prior to this that had great reputations. He was able to cast Janet Leigh as Marion, and this was his first and only choice for the role, which would become important later, and Anthony Perkins as the film's antagonist Norman Bates. Halloween, on the other hand, came from a completely different set of context. Halloween was derived from the indie scene, having two practically unknown figures step in to create the now iconic horror film. John Carpenter, a pretty unknown director unlike Hitchcock, was sought out by an independent producer named Irwin Yablans. The film had a basic premise: a serial killer hunting babysitters on Halloween.
He said, let's do a movie about these babysitters who get stalked by a killer.
Why babysitters though? Well, it's actually pretty important to the film's context. In the 1970s, you either were a babysitter or you had a babysitter. This idea was so relative to audiences that right away everyone had something to connect to, which made it scary. Unlike Hitchcock, who was able to hire an extensive crew for $62,000, Carpenter was only paid $10,000 to direct, write, as well as score the film's famous soundtrack. The film was originally fittingly titled The Babysitter Murders before they added the Halloween concept to the film. Due to the film's minimal budget of around $300,000, which sounds like a lot, but Psycho had a budget of $500,000 more, they were only able to obtain one known actor, Donald Pleasance, to play Dr. Samuel Loomis, who was Michael Myers' doctor in the asylum. And little fun fact, the name Sam Loomis for the doctor actually came from the name of Janet Leigh's boyfriend in Psycho. Believe it or not, Donald Pleasance wasn't even their first choice or even their second choice for the role. Both Peter Cushing from Star Wars and Christopher Lee turned down the roles due to the salary. Jamie Lee Curtis also at the time was unknown to all audiences, but Carpenter thought it would be interesting to try and use Janet Leigh's relationship to Jamie Lee Curtis, having be her daughter, to try and use that for advertisement. The main murderer, Michael Myers, was actually Carpenter's friend from college at the time, who was obviously also unknown to anyone and took also extremely minimal payment. Both films underwent pretty rocky productions with budget constraints on both sides, although obviously Halloween had a notably rougher start than Psycho. I could go on all day about the actual productions of these films, but I'd be talking all day. Although I will note how awesome it was, while the low budget of Halloween required the filmmakers to spray paint a Captain Kirk mask white to create what is pretty much the most famous horror mask of all time. But what's important to note here is how the budget constraints affected the films individually. Halloween had the actors actually use their own clothes due to how low the budget was, rather than providing a wardrobe like Psycho. Halloween also wasn't filmed on a set, but rather on real locations in California, which acted as Haddonfield, Illinois, which is a fictional location. They even had local children dress up as trick-or-treaters on a day that wasn't even Halloween and go door to door. One could argue that this added to the realism that Halloween had and made the fear of a psycho killer in such a common suburban setting even more terrifying. Psycho, however, was filmed on a Universal set, which is actually still up today, making it a much more controlled and artificial setting. Not that the film really shows this or uses it in a negative way, perhaps from aside from some shots of the Bates' home, which do look a little haunted housey and on a set. Violence and gore, or somewhat lack thereof, is also a really important aspect of both of these films. Halloween and Psycho showcase murder. Halloween actually showcases quite a bit of murder, having 5 people get murdered, but never any gory scenes, and the same applies to Psycho, in which the most famous shower scene, Murder, which many people think the knife they see stabbing into her, never actually stabs her, and there's extremely little gore, only having a little bit of blood on the ground. In fact, one of the other reasons Hitchcock used black and white, aside from budgetary constraints, was because he needed to keep that scene less graphic. Although Carpenter had denied it many times, many critics and many film scholars did find a connection between Halloween, the sex and murder aspect, having the characters always getting murdered after sexual interactions, as well as drug and alcohol use. Many believe this was used to scare audience to the quote-unquote immoral teenagers of the 1970s, that once again Carpenter just said that sex was a thing that students in high school were having, and he thought it would fit and be more applicable to audiences. It also become a formulaic characteristic of the horror genre, because right after this film, when copycats like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street hit Hollywood, they also used this sex and murder aspect. However, Psycho actually scared censorship enforcers, and not in the way you might think. Sure, the film was violent and sometimes sexual, with Marion in the shower as well as the opening scene with her boyfriend, but Hitchcock did things to purposely fight against censors. Psycho is actually the first film to show a toilet flushing when Marion throws away a piece of paper, and this was a really big deal to a lot of filmmakers. The film did unfortunately have to go under some editing to meet approval standards, but overall the film was considered very risky for its time. And let's look at the use of suspense in both of these films. Hitchcock and Carpenter make great use of distinct camera techniques, different, to create these effects, but ultimately they create the same sensation of being on the edge of your seat. Carpenter uses a lot of first person to put you directly in the shoes of Michael Myers, the murderer, following him as he hunts his prey. He also uses a lot of tracking shots to slow the pacing while also making you wonder just where Michael is hiding while you're watching Laurie. Hitchcock uses suspense in other ways, creating suspense as a sense of mystery. Why is Norman's mother murdering these people? Why can't we see her face? And why do we never actually see his mother? The film also makes use of its mise-en-scène, especially with the use of Norman's taxidermy and the subtle references that these stuffed birds make to its predators and death. But obviously it's also a reference to his mother, who is, spoiler alert, a decaying corpse dressed as if she was still alive. Halloween unfortunately doesn't have many of these subtle effects like Psycho does, possibly due to the film's lower budget. However, a small reference may be seen in the use of "Don't Fear the Reaper" on the radio as Laurie rides with her friend in the car just before the murder spree starts. Halloween and Psycho also share some similarities in terms of reveals, especially with the reveal of dead bodies. Laurie discovers all her friends' bodies in the old Myers house along with the tombstone of Michael's sister Judith. Bodies are found in cabinets and swung down on her with Carpenter's genius score. Hitchcock uses a similar effect with the reveal of Norman's mother as the chair slowly turns around to reveal the rotting corpse. Now, I can't acknowledge the use of these films' musical scores and the effects of the terror and suspense, particularly when a character is in danger. Both are extremely intense and fast-paced scores that make your heart beat faster, and they are used to repeatedly signal that a death is coming. Halloween and Psycho are two of the horror's most famous films, and for good reason. Although their ideas and themes are similar, the context and techniques used to create the same effects were very different and each benefit from these differences in their own way. Horror will continue to build upon the current context in order to stay relevant to its audiences, and as always, it will continue to stay terrible.
Damn, this is some scary shit!